Our second presenter is Alf Seegert, a professor of English, again here at the University of Utah.
I don't do well with boom microphones, so I'm going to do my best to affix myself to the podium here. No, it's okay. I'd rather have that than the other kind. I'm hard to please, Joe. Yeah. Okay, hi. I'm Dr. Seegert. It's become a commonplace that literature has the power to evoke empathy. This makes sense. Empathy is fundamentally rooted in a capacity for imaginative identification, an ability to simulate in oneself the experience of another, something at which literature excels. I like how C.S. Lewis puts it. Literature enlarges our being by admitting us to experiences not our own. My own eyes are not enough for me. The man who is contented to be only himself, and therefore less a self, is in prison. My own eyes are not enough for me. Even the eyes of all humanity are not enough. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. Very gladly would I learn what face things present to a mouse or a bee. More gladly still would I perceive the olfactory worlds charged with all the information and emotion it carries for a dog. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. I would argue that everything C.S. Lewis says here about the power of literature to admit us to experiences not our own applies equally, and in some instances, perhaps even more potently, to video games. I should explain right away that I'm not talking about something terribly obvious, like the power of video games to overwhelm us with high-resolution graphics and immersive sound, shoving us face forward over the brink of a technological sublime, which they often do. Instead, I'm arguing for an intimate connection between the ability of video games to produce a sense of presence, the sense of being there, and their capacity to evoke empathy. Importantly, this sense of presence is not simply a one-directional affair generated by visuals and sound. Virtual reality researchers like Wynand Eiselstein have shown that player actions, rather than graphical realism, are most responsible for generating a sense of presence in virtual spaces like video games. Eiselstein goes so far as to conclude that presence is tantamount to successfully supported action in the environment. Being there thus becomes the ability to do there. I'm interested in how doing there as being there can spur our imaginative identification with the plights and joys of others, including the radically other. The doing is especially important because when you perform actions in a video game, the game changes in response. Other texts, like books and films, can inspire any number of active reader responses and generate galaxies of potential signifieds. But these texts are not interactive. They do not change signifiers in response to what their audience does. However active our responses might be, we are not in a position to enact the difficult decisions which, say, a character in a novel must. In contrast, the robust interaction of video games creates a feedback loop wherein all parties participate, each one changing its responses based on the actions of the other participants. Such interactivity engenders not just presence, but also a sense of empathy, precisely because the players perform character roles from the inside out. As a result, players identify intensely with their in-game avatars and the game worlds these avatars inhabit. Before you stop me and rightly cite instances of how this identification with an in-game character can result in atrocities, virtual or otherwise, the ability to murder prostitutes in Grand Theft Auto being perhaps the most infamous recent example, I should point out that I'm not arguing that empathy is automatically compassionate or even inherently good. A torturer might call on empathy to produce all the more exquisite pain in his victim. And many a first-person shooter video game creates identification with little more than an outstretched arm wielding a gun. Put another way, Marshall McLuhan is right when he says that the medium is the message, but the message is the message too. Thankfully, there has been a recent surge in video games that do more than enable male teenage power fantasies. Instead, they allow players to inhabit psychologically complex characters in morally challenging situations. Some of these games are by major studios, like the much-lauded The Last of Us, an interactive reimagining of Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road. Likewise, Spec Ops: The Line critiques the pervasive military shooter genre by making the player complicit in the violence unleashed by his in-game character. Its horrors and revelations echo those of Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, with an added sense of dread. To complete the game, you have to become another Kurtz yourself. In the video game Journey, you traverse terrifying terrain accompanied by an anonymous partner, a live human being from somewhere else in the world, anywhere, and you'll never know who. Usually, such online interactions are predictably disastrous. Anonymity plus audience equals asshole. But in Journey, players wordlessly aid each other and shield one another from the elements because they very quickly discover that they want to. The game is designed to reward fellowship. Equally potent examples have emerged from small-team, often single-person independent game studios. These games emphasize narrative and player interaction over graphical realism. In Thomas Was Alone, the player takes on the role of different quadrilaterals, each with its own story and its own combined disabilities and superpowers, who band together and ultimately sacrifice themselves to liberate their fellow AIs. Through emergence, flat geometry yields round character. In a recent story, National Public Radio characterized this sea change in video gaming as, quote, a shift from enemies to emotions. With my remaining time, I want to look at two recent indie video games that make especially strong use of the interactive medium to evoke empathic identification through the player's performance. I assigned these games in a class I recently created and began teaching called Video Games and Storytelling. And big thanks to Dr. Kate Coles for first suggesting such a class. So that really rocks. Thank you. The first game is called Shelter, a survival game in which players take on the role of a mother badger, attempting to lead her cubs to safety through a hazardous wilderness. In all my video gaming since childhood, I never really expected to play a mother, let alone a mother badger. Now I have, and I cried a lot along the way. Shelter is an especially potent example of doing there is being there, because your entire focus as a player is taking care of your badger cubs. You become a mother badger by acting like one. As one of my students puts it, quote, with Shelter, I truly felt that each of my cubs were my own. I worried about them the entire game. I tried my best to make sure each of them received the same amount of food and overall care as the others, and I always accounted for all of them before pressing forward. This game really allowed basic parental instincts to flourish within me. When one of my cubs died, I truly felt the loss. It was so disheartening to hear the screams of the cubs as they were killed off camera, so much that it honestly made me tear up. I also remember being filled with a lot of rage, anger, and desire for revenge. However, the ending of Shelter really made me stop and realize that each creature in that game, whether they were prey or predator, were in the same circumstances as me. I simply saw through one perspective. One of our classmates brought up a fine point that no creature in the game is beyond empathy. The other recent game I want to examine briefly is Papers, Please, a dystopian document thriller, an underused genre there. In it, the player takes on the role of an impoverished border inspector in a fictional Soviet bloc nation during the height of the Cold War. Papers, Please is striking for how much it achieves with so little. The graphics are rendered in a deliberately pixelated retro 1980s style, and the main actions performed by the player are to inspect the visas of travelers wanting to enter our Statska, correlate their information, and finally stamp approved or denied on their passports. The basic game mechanic melds seamlessly with the narrative because you are paid based on the number of immigrants that you accurately process and let across the border. But you dwell in a miserable, brutalist-designed apartment block with endless bills to pay. Some of them are summarized up here. Rent, heating, food, medicine for your sick son, relatives in need of support, and never, ever enough money to pay for them all. For that reason, you become tempted to let regulations slide and take bribes from those attempting to cross the border illegally. About Papers, Please, one of my students writes, quote, "By inhabiting an avatar, we become invested in the game, and temporarily the line blurs between the protagonist and ourselves. When I allow myself to become invested in my player character, suddenly it's not the border inspector detaining someone. For a brief moment, it is me detaining them." This experience can become painful and guilt-inducing because of your complicity as a player in what happens to those in your power. In Papers, Please, you empathize so well with your character's predicament that you quickly learn that you can't empathize with everyone trying to cross the border. Although you might want to let a young girl without papers enter the country to escape a child sex trafficker, if you get caught breaking the rules, it will be your own family that suffers. Or maybe she's really a terrorist who will explode the moment she crosses the border. Or maybe you'll just take a bribe. Ironically enough, Papers, Please becomes both an empathy simulator and a corruption simulator. And by playing it, you even learn to empathize with others' lack of empathy. So, why does it matter if video games evoke empathy? It matters because I think the influence and the possibilities of video games continue to be underestimated. For many, especially many in academia still, video games remain a cultural shorthand for violence and male teenage power fantasies. But as of this year, over half of those who play video games are women. The video game industry has also become the single largest entertainment industry in the world, bigger than either DVDs or theatrical releases. And as I hope I have demonstrated, a new wave of video games has opened up vast creative possibilities through participatory storytelling. When I say things like this to my class on video games and storytelling, I'm preaching to the choir. But when I'm outside my classroom, like here, I feel obliged to emphasize just how potent a force video games are, not just economically, but as a revolutionary new art form, at least as significant as the emergence of cinema a century ago. To conclude, video games can evoke empathy through both their form and their content. Formally, video games habituate players to take on the role of others from the inside out. With respect to content, performing as radically different others can open up respect for alterity via humane identification with the inhuman and the marginalized. Through video games, you can become everything from a sentient quadrilateral to a mother badger. I didn't mention that you can also play as a gust of wind, an interrogator of terrorists, and a child refugee in the Sudan. There is now even a depression simulator to help those without depression empathize with those suffering from it. The potential to inhabit and participate in radically other perspectives decenters narrow identifications with class, gender, race, national identity, ability, and even species, undermining anthropocentric assumptions in which only humans count as subjects of meaning-filled lives. Our exodus to the virtual doesn't have to be a flight from empathy. I think the empathy-evoking potential of video games is summed up best by one of my students. When asked what differentiates video games from other media, he answered that it's not the ability to inhabit multiple perspectives, but to enact them, to not only bear witness, but bear responsibility. Thank you.